week, we delve into one of the most notorious cults in American history, the Manson family. In the late 1960s, Charles Manson and his followers captured the nation's attention with their chilling blend of countercultural ideals and horrific violence. Today, we'll explore the origins of Manson's philosophy, the dynamics within the family, and the shocking crimes that would forever change the landscape of American society. Join us as we unravel the complexities of this dark chapter, examining not just the events, but the broader cultural implications that continue to resonate today. I'm Sammy.
And I'm Nicole.
And we are Spooky Sleuths.
Hey guys.
Hello.
I am so excited for this episode. I know Manson's talked about a lot, but he was crazy. He was one of my, not that you should have a favorite cult leader, but he would be one of mine.
I learned a lot about him doing this because I didn't know a lot of details. I knew who he was. I knew what part of what they did, but I learned a lot. I'm really excited to share this episode.
All right, so let's dig in. Where are we starting?
All right. Charles Manson was born No Name Maddox on November 12th of 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio. He never knew his father, but his mother, Kathleen Maddox, was only 16 when she had him.
And she didn't name him?
No. His name was No Name Maddox on his birth certificate. I did read that his father was a man named Colonel Scott, who was a laborer that was married to another woman when Charles was conceived. So I'm guessing that's why he's not really named as his father anywhere. After birthing Charles, Kathleen remarried, and she gave Charles this man's last name and decided on Charles as a first name. I think her father's name was Charles.
That makes sense. It's better than no name.
Right. He was unnamed at birth and giving him the No Name Maddox on his birth certificate. That's just crazy.
Yeah.
Kathleen was not the best mother, and not just because she was 16. Some teens can totally change their life around when they have a child that young, but Kathleen did not. She was a runaway who left Ashland, Kentucky, and her devoutly religious family to head to Cincinnati. She was an alcoholic and a sex worker, but was also neglectful to young Charles. I read that once she exchanged Charles for a beer, and she left him there for several days. In 1939, she was arrested for an armed robbery that she committed with her brother. So Charles went to live with his Aunt Glenna and Uncle Bill in McMecken, West Virginia. Kathleen and her brother were imprisoned at Moundsville Penitentiary, which is not far from McMecken. Charles's aunt and uncle wanted him to see his mother as much as possible, so he spent a lot of time at the prison. He actually wrote in a letter later in life saying, "The big stones were like the temple of a solemn place. I never realized I would spend my life in such temples of suffering." Which is kind of crazy because, I mean, we've been to Moundsville. Hey.
Yeah.
Kathleen was...
I'll link that above up here.
Kathleen was released from prison when Charles was 8 years old, but she soon saw her son was going down a bad path. In the 5 years...
At 8 years old?
Yes.
He's going down a bad path at 8 years old?
Yes.
Oh, my.
In the 5 years she was incarcerated, Charles became very manipulative and larcenous. He skipped school, would beg strangers on the street for money, and manipulated his mother to control her. After remarrying...
It's like the makings of a cult. Like, of a cult leader.
Right?
That manipulation. He's fine-tuning that art early.
He is. After remarrying, Kathleen hoped having a father figure would help control Charles. She was wrong, as the man she married could not hold a job. He was an alcoholic, and he could not parent Charles. The couple agreed to send Charles to Jabot's School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana. This is a Catholic school for troubled boys, which Charles hated. He would run away and tell Kathleen it was a torture chamber, but Kathleen would send him back. Charles spent the rest of his teen years in reform schools, juvenile detention centers, and even state jails. When Charles would run away, he wouldn't be alone. He'd convince other boys to go with him, and they'd steal cars. They'd always get caught, and Charles would always receive the heaviest punishment. So he was a mini cult leader then.
Yeah.
When Charles was 20, he was released to his aunt and uncle again and came back to McMecken. Kathleen had moved to California, so they were the closest relatives to him. It was in McMecken that he met his first wife, Rosalie Willis, who was either 15 or 17 years old at the time. Sources vary on that.
And how old was he?
He was 20.
Okay.
I'm hoping she was 17 while she's still technically a minor. It's a lot better than 15. Charles married Rosalie in 1995.
Whoa.
In 1955, and that summer found out that Rosalie was pregnant. Charles wanted to head west to Los Angeles, where his mother was, so naturally he stole a car in Ohio, and the couple headed to L.A.
That's how you get there. That's how you make mom proud.
Yeah. Things were good when they first got to Los Angeles. They lived with Kathleen, and Charles began working odd jobs to earn a little bit of money. At the end of the summer, a cop checked his license plate, though, only to find out that the car was a stolen 1953 Mercury from Ohio. Charles was arrested and sent to prison. This was his first adult prison sentence, but it would not be his last.
Yeah, because the first one was like the juvenile detention center, right?
Right.
Okay.
While in prison, Rosalie divorced Charles.
She's like, what did I get myself into?
Right? When she remarried, their son took her new husband's last name to avoid association with Charles.
Probably good in hindsight.
Right. The son, Jay White, never had a relationship with Charles, and he ended up unaliving himself in 1993.
It's horrible.
Jay's son believes he did this because he couldn't live down who his father was. Charles spent 1956 to 1967 in various prisons for various crimes. He was charged with mail tampering, check fraud, pimping, auto theft, and parole violations.
Big pimpin'.
A prison psychiatrist at the time said Charles had deep-seated personality problems.
Yeah.
You don't say.
That's like the most minimal diagnosis I can think of for that guy.
In 1959, Charles was out of prison for a short time when he met and married his second wife, Leona Ray Stevens. According to a book called Helter Skelter, The True Story of the Manson Murders, Leona pled with Charles to marry her because that would help him win a 10-year suspended prison sentence. So he was up for 10 years in prison, but she thought if they got married, there was no way he'd go to prison.
That's not a thing. They don't care.
Charles was sent back to prison for sex trafficking charges for pimping out Leona and another woman in New Mexico. She divorced him in 1963, but not before having his second son, Charles Luther Manson. Charles Luther Manson has also changed his name, and little is known about him. When he got out of prison in 1967, Charles moved to San Francisco. This move is where Charles found who he was really meant to be, as he began attracting young people around him. He called these people the family, as his own biological family failed him, so he created his own. The family was a communal religious cult. He preyed upon young people who were into the hippie lifestyle, while his main focus was on attracting underage girls.
Well, that tracks. But a lot of cults call themselves the family, but this isn't associated with the Family International or anything, right? It's the Manson family. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, everywhere refers to it as the family.
Yeah, it's just the family. So it has no affiliation with any of the others that we're aware of.
Yeah. Yeah, everything called them the family, not the Manson family, so I didn't put that throughout here.
Oh yeah, no worries. Family. Because we talk about cults so often, I didn't know if you found anything that was tying them to anyone else.
Nope. Charles was his own monster.
Of course he was.
So remember, Charles was very manipulative even from a young age. He used his personality in combination with LSD, rambling lectures, and a minimalistic living conditions to gain members in his family. The main seller of the cult was Charles' lectures about the impending apocalypse. Manson was a preacher of the Helter Skelter scenario. This stemmed from a premonition or prophecy that Charles spoke of. Charles claimed that the apocalypse would be started with a race war between white and black people. Charles created this scenario by referencing the Book of Revelation and most famously, songs from the Beatles' White Album. Charles began speaking of this before he officially named it Helter Skelter, But he was very convincing to his followers that this was really about to happen. He took the name Helter Skelter from a Beatles song with the same name, as he interpreted the lyrics to be concerned with the impending war.
That's my favorite Beatles song, and I don't associate it with any of that.
I love the White Album. I have 2 copies of it in storage.
Yeah, Helter Skelter is both mine and CJ's like favorite Beatles song, and I don't get those vibes at all. He's crazy.
During the 60s, there were a lot of riots across the country that involved black citizens and white police officers. In 1967 alone, there were 158 riots, 17,000 arrests, and 83 deaths.
That's disgusting. I mean, really, you hear about the riots and like going through history, but to hear those numbers spouted out like that, Sammy, that's gross.
Yeah. 83 people died. 17,000 arrested. That is insane. This was all happening during the Civil Rights Movement. So Charles used the real world issues to create this narrative that a civil war would break out, that he would be the ultimate beneficiary of the war. Charles believed that black men would no longer have access to white women as they did in the 60s. Okay.
It's not how any of this works.
Because of that, they would commit violent crimes against white people. Charles told the family, quote, "A group of real blacks would come out of the ghettos and do an atrocious crime in the richer sections of Los Angeles and other cities. They would do an atrocious murder with stabbing, killing, cutting bodies to pieces, smearing blood on the walls, writing pigs on the walls, in the victim's own blood." Unquote. Then the frightened whites would retaliate by killing black people. Militant black people would exploit it to provoke a war of almost extinction of white people by black people. The Manson family wouldn't need to worry, though, as they would be hiding out in the war. They would be hiding out the war in a secret city under Death Valley, where they'd find this city through a hole in the ground.
That makes sense.
When the war is over, they would rise from underground and rule the black people. According to Charles, the black people would no longer want to kill because they completed the white man's karma. Black people would have no capability of running the world, so they would all turn to Charles for leadership. I'm not going to say a quote that Charles said in regards to what the black people would say who came to him for leadership, because it is very racist, and that's just not something that we believe in sharing on this podcast. I was tempted to put it here, though, so you'd hear exactly how he thought, but I don't want it to be taken the wrong way. And plus, he also uses some language that I will never use on or off the podcast. So,
yeah. So if you're interested, his quotes are everywhere. Yep.
It'll show you just how racist he is.
And I'm not even going to put the text on the screen for it.
No. Charles had some qualities that we typically see in most cult members. We established he was very charismatic, and he was a doomsday cult. They had that mentality. But he was also very controlling. He controlled all of the family members' money, of course.
Well, that tracks. I mean, he was controlling Kathleen as a child.
Yeah. He also decided when members would eat and sleep. Sex was controlled by Charles, who dictated when members would have sex and who they would have sex with. Family members were also forced to take LSD in amounts that Charles determined, which was always way more than he took. So let's talk about who some of the key family members were. I want to go through these because it can get very confusing with how many people played a role in this. And
because everyone remembers Charles Manson, but he had so many pawns and there were so many people involved in the family. And
I tried to make it simplified, but it can be very confusing. I was a little bit confused writing it, so I had to try to make it better. First is Charles Tex Watson. He was from Dallas, Texas, and was always a religious guy. He was working in January 1967 as a baggage handler for an airline. Tex used his free airline tickets from his job to visit his frat brother in LA, where he became interested in the hippie lifestyle. Tex was driving one day and picked up a hitchhiker who ended up being Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. Dennis Wilson was friends with Charles, and Charles was living with him and the family at that time. From there, Tex was an important member of the family. Next is Susan Atkins. Susan was also known as Sadie, Sadie Glutz, Sadie Mae Glutz, or Sexy Sadie within the Manson family. Susan was working as a dancer in 1967 and met Charles while he was playing guitar at the home she was living in with her friends. Susan's home was raided by police a few weeks later, so rather than being homeless, Susan decided to join the Manson family.
That makes sense.
She came to genuinely believe that Charles was Jesus. Next is Mary Brunner. Mary was one of the first members of the family. She was working as a library assistant at UC Berkeley when she met Charles in 1965. Charles had just gotten out of prison a few weeks before meeting Mary and needed a place to stay, so she let him stay there. They quickly became lovers, and she became pregnant in 1967. Mary gave birth to Charles's third child, Valentine Michael Manson, in a condemned house they were living in, and had the assistance of other family members for the birth. After Mary was eventually arrested for credit card fraud, her parents gained custody and changed the child's name to Michael Brunner. Michael never contacted Charles after he was taken from the family, despite Charles writing several letters to him. So Charles had 3 kids and none wanted anything to do with him. Not surprised.
I wonder if he reached out to the other 2 or just...
I'm not sure. I saw that he wrote excessive letters to Michael, but I didn't see the other ones.
Yeah.
I remember watching a documentary once, though, where this guy has a Manson museum and has a bunch of letters that he wrote to his kids. So I think he wrote to the others, but probably not as much. I'm not sure. Next up is Linda Casbian. Linda was intelligent and shy as a child, but ended up running away from home at age 16. She came to LA looking for God, as she claimed. After a few marriages and a child, living in various places across the country, she wound up back in LA. She heard about the Manson family from a friend who said there was an idyllic ranch where a commune of hippies were. She was told they were establishing...
It sounds so fun.
It does.
It sounds so fun. Like, okay, a ranch with like-minded people. I'm game. No.
Yeah. She was told they were establishing a paradise to escape an impending race war. So her and her daughter traveled to the ranch. She had sex with Tex Watson and never left. Next,
was that good?
Apparently. Next is Patricia Crent.
And by she, you mean Linda, right? Not
Yes,
her daughter?
Yes. Okay. Next is Patricia Krenwinkel. Patricia met Charles in 1967 in Manhattan Beach. She was smitten with him, and they had sex that very night. Patricia was very starved for attention, and Charles gave it to her. So she was hooked from the beginning to every word he said. Then there's Leslie Van Houten. Leslie was already living in a hippie commune when she met Charles. She lived with 4 other people, but they had a falling out. So she decided to follow her friend Catherine to the cult at the ranch. Finally, let's talk about Robert Kenneth Beausoleil. Robert was a juvenile delinquent from age 15. He came to LA when he was 16 and was interested in the counterculture music scene and acting.
At 15 years old? No way. I mean, 16.
Robert was a musician too, which is something he and Charles bonded over. He met Charles in 1968 when he was living with Gary Hinman, who we'll talk about next. There were 20 to 30 people in the Manson family at one point, but these are just the ones that are the most important.
These are the ones that didn't flit in and out all the time.
Yeah. Like I said, Charles was very into music at this time. The Manson family made music even from prison. Charles produced CDs. We actually have one of those CDs right behind us. Charles became good friends with a music teacher named Gary Hinman. Through his connections, he also met a producer named Terry Melcher. He was kind of into Charles' music, but ultimately decided not to work with him. Gary, who was actually very close to the Manson family, he was almost like he was almost a member.
Like if you would have lived with him, he would have been a member.
Yeah.
Type deal.
Gary Hinman was murdered by the Manson family after he didn't help close the deal with Terry. Charles sent 3 family members to Gary's home on July 25th of 1969, Robert, Leslie, and Mary. They were supposedly there to convince Gary to join the family and turn over all his assets to Charles, as Charles thought Gary was very rich. He was a music teacher. The family members held him hostage for 2 days because he denied having any money.
He was a teacher.
They don't make good money. They should, but they don't. Yeah. Charles showed up after 2 days and used a sword to cut Gary's face and ear. Following that attack, Robert stabbed Gary to death, supposedly because Charles told him to. Either Robert, Mary, or Leslie used Gary's blood to write "Political Piggy" and a panther paw on the wall before they left. This was Charles' way of making it look like the Black Panthers committed the crime. The next murder that the Manson family is responsible for is that of Donald Shea. The family resided on an area of Spawn Ranch in California. Donald was a stuntman at the ranch, and he was a horse wrangler. On August 16, 1969, the police raided the ranch due to the family being a suspect in another set of killings that I'll come to in a few minutes. But I wanted to tell that one after.
Yeah.
Charles believed that Donald helped set up the raid because he was trying to get them off the ranch. So they think Donald went to the police and said, "This is the guy who did it."
I mean, if he did, though, was he wrong? No.
Right? But also, Donald was a white man married to a black woman.
Oh, so he was like the worst of the worst in Charles'
did not like
eyes.
that. It isn't exactly clear how they murdered Donald, but they do know it occurred 10 days after the raid, and his body was buried intact despite the family claiming that they dismembered him and scattered his body parts. The next murder is probably what the Manson family is the most famous for, the Tate-LaBianca murders.
I always forget that there were the murders that occurred in addition to the Tate-LaBianca.
Me too.
Like, I remember those ones. But now that you've mentioned the other ones, I'm like, oh, yeah, that was a thing.
Yeah. So remember Terry Melcher, the music producer from before? He moved shortly after meeting Charles, and he sold his LA home to actress Sharon Tate. Sharon was married to director Roman Polanski at the time, and she was also pregnant with their child. I don't know if Charles knew that Terry had moved. I kind of think he did, but a lot of sources say that he had no idea that wasn't Terry's home anymore.
See, I'd always heard that he sent the family there looking for Terry, but the other people were there.
Right. So, I don't know. I don't know.
Couldn't figure it out either, for sure either way.
Yeah. Tex claims that Charles told them to destroy everyone in the home, which leads me to think that they knew it wasn't just Terry as the only occupant.
So even if he did think Terry was still there, he wanted
thought
everyone.
Someone else lived there too, so
can kill them all.
And it could be, in my opinion, as he's setting it up as if someone was trying to kill Terry, not as if someone's trying to kill Sharon. You know.
I mean, Charles he's smart, so that wouldn't surprise me either.
Yeah. Anyway, on August 8th, 1964, 4 of the Manson family members went to Sharon Tate's home. She was not alone in her home. She had guests, including Jay Sebring, Wojciech Fryoski, Abigail Folger, who was the heir to the Folger coffee business, was the heir, William Garrettson, who was the caretaker, and his friend, Stephen Parent. Roman Polanski was out of the country working on a movie, so he wasn't home to be a victim. The 4 family members arrived at the home around midnight on August 9th. Tex, Susan, Linda, and Patricia. They cut the phone lines and backed their car to the bottom of the hill and walked up to the house. The group was smart enough not to try to mess with the gate, as they thought it could be electrified or it would sound an alarm. So they climbed up a brushy embankment to the side of the gate to get in. As they approached the house, a car came towards them. Tex told the 3 female family members to lie in the bushes, and he approached the vehicle. It was Stephen Parent leaving after visiting the caretaker, William Garrettson. Stephen begged for his life as Tex pointed a weapon at him.
As Tex pointed.
Tex slashed Stephen's palm and tore off his watch and shot him 4 times in the chest and abdomen. then simply turned off the car and pushed it away from the gate. The family proceeded towards the house where they selected a window to cut a screen out of. Tex, Susan, and Patricia entered the home, and Linda went to keep watch by the gate. Wojciech Fryoski, I apologize, I'm saying that wrong, I know I am, was asleep on the couch and was woken up by the group whispering. The family kicked him in the head, and when asked why they were there, the male in the group stated, oh, I forgot to change that part. And when asked why they were there, Tex stated, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." The female family members proceeded to find the rest of the occupants and bring them into the living room. Sharon and Jay were tied together by their necks with a nylon rope slung over the ceiling beam in the living room. Jay was pleading with Tex not to treat Sharon so rough because she was 8.5 months pregnant. So he was shot and stabbed 7 times. Abigail gave the family $70 that she had on her. Wojciech Fryoski was tied up with a towel, but was able to free himself. He was fighting with Susan and ended up getting stabbed in the leg. He made it to the front door, but Tex was not letting him escape. He was hit in the head with a weapon, stabbed several times, and shot twice, but he still wasn't dead yet. He began crawling to the front yard, but Tex continued to stab him. Wojciech Fryoski was stabbed 51 times and had 13 blows to the head from Tex's weapon. The weapon was actually broken from the beating.
Oh my gosh, that is excessive.
Yeah. Abigail was able to escape and ran out of the house, but Patricia caught up with her, tackled her, and stabbed her. Tex came over to complete the murder by stabbing her more for a total of 28 stab wounds. Sharon was still alive in the house, begging for her life and the life of her unborn child. She was asking to be allowed to live long enough to give birth. Susan and Tex weren't going to comply and began stabbing her 16 times, killing her and thus her unborn child. Jay was hung after his death, but Sharon was hung while she was still alive. The caretaker, William Garretson, he wasn't killed in the attack.
Did they even know he was there?
I don't think so.
Because he was in the guest house,
yes,
right?
They had like a guest house for like the caretaker, or like some people put like their maids up in there and stuff like that. After committing the murders, the family was instructed to leave a sign, something witchy, by Charles. Susan wrote pig on the front door of the home using Sharon's blood. The last murders committed...
That was witchy?
Yeah.
Okay, we have vast differences in opinion on what is witchy.
The last murders committed by the Manson family were that of Leno LaBianca and Rosemary LaBianca. When Tex, Susan, Patricia, and Linda left the Tate home, they joined Charles, Leslie, and another family member, Clem Grogan, for a drive on the night of August 10th. Charles was not happy with how the murders went down at the Tate home, so he had further murder plans. The group went to a house next door to one that they had previously attended a party at. Charles entered the home and returned to the car, letting the rest of the group know that he had tied up the people in the house. Tex, Leslie, and Patricia entered the house with Charles. They tied up Leno, so Charles hadn't actually tied him up.
Oh, I was like...
They had to go in and tie up Leno.
I was really confused. I was like, how did... Like, I know he was charismatic, but how would he walk in and be like, let me tie you up real quick?
Yeah. Leno's wife, Rosemary, was brought out from her bedroom when Tex covered their heads with pillowcases and bound them together with lamp cords. Tex had Leslie and Patricia take Rosemary back to the bedroom while he stabbed Leno with a chrome-plated bayonet.
That seems excessive.
Yeah. After he killed Leno, Tex went to the bedroom to find Rosemary swinging a lamp at Leslie and Patricia. Tex was able to get close to Rosemary and stabbed her several times with the bayonet. He went back to Leno, stabbed him 11 more times. He's already dead, but we're going to stab him 11 more times. And he carved the word war into his stomach. Meanwhile, Leslie and Patricia continued to stab Rosemary, leaving her with at least 41 stab wounds, many of which occurred after she had already died.
I can never wrap my head around the brutality of the murders that they commit. Like,
Right. We're going to continue to stab after you've already killed people.
yeah. Like, I'm not condoning murder, and I don't know how to say this without coming across that way, but if you're going to do that to someone, like, I feel like there would be planning. There would be, like, I don't know. I can't even think of what I'm trying to say. Like, they just went in a tornado and messed stuff up and left.
And it seems like they had no idea when they were, like, there was no group planning on their part. Like, Charles made a decision, you're going to go kill these people. And they just did it. There was no thought put into it. It doesn't seem like anyway.
No.
Because, I mean, I think after the LaBiancas were killed, Tex took a shower in their home. Patricia was to write Rise and Death to Pigs on the walls in blood. She also wrote Helter Skelter on the door of the refrigerator. Patricia returned to Leno and stabbed him 14 more times.
Why?
With a carving fork and stuck a steak knife in his throat.
Like, I don't understand the level of brutality of these members.
They're crazy. Like, legitimately crazy.
Like, how crazy were they before Charles got his hands in them? Because obviously there had to be, like, something going on.
And I wonder how much LSD they did before they did these murders, too.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, I forgot about the amount of, like, I forgot about them doing LSD. So that might explain the brutality then.
Yeah. The group had to hitchhike home after the murders as Charles returned home to Spawn Ranch. But he dropped off the rest of the group at a man named Saladin Nader. After dropping off the rest of the group members at Saladin Nader's home, who was a Lebanese actor, apparently the group was dropped off and was supposed to kill Saladin, but decided to leave without doing so after knocking on the wrong door of the apartment building. It's suspected that was on purpose so they didn't have to kill anyone.
At that point, maybe they were like, yo, we're done for the night.
Although these are the only murders the group was charged with, they are suspected of killing at least 12 more people. After the Tate and LaBianca murders, the LAPD detectives that were working on the Gary Hinman case were assigned to the Tate murders, while the LaBianca murders were investigated separately, partially due to the police believing they weren't all connected. I don't know why you wouldn't think they were connected, but they all had similar weapons used, similar stab wounds, in addition to bloody words on the walls. The detectives thought narcotics might have been a motive initially, but that really didn't lead anywhere. The groundskeeper, William Garrettson, was the first suspect, but he told the police he didn't see or hear anything, and he was released after passing a polygraph exam. Not long after October of 1969, Charles and the other members were arrested for auto theft. Susan was in jail, and she confessed to the Sharon Tate murders to a fellow inmate. Charles also told a friend that he was murdering people before the Tate murders occurred.
He hasn't murdered anyone that we're aware of.
Right. This kind of sealed the fate for the Manson family because they couldn't keep their mouths shut.
Yeah.
Susan Adkins was convicted of the Tate, LaBianca, and Gary Hinman's murders. She was sentenced to death, but that sentence was commuted to life in prison after California invalidated all death sentences prior to 1972. They were all sentenced in 1971. She became a born-again Christian in prison and was remorseful. Susan was denied parole, and she died in prison from brain cancer in 2009. Leslie Van Houten was convicted of murdering the LaBiancas. She was sentenced to the death penalty as well, but her sentence was also commuted. Leslie was actually granted parole in 2023, and she currently lives in a halfway house in California. Patricia Krenwinkel was convicted of the Tate murders. She was sentenced to death, but her sentence was commuted to life in prison. She was denied parole 14 times before finally being approved. However, the California governor, Gavin Newsom, blocked her parole, stating, "After an independent and thorough review, the evidence establishes that Miss Krenwinkel is not suitable for parole and cannot be safely released from prison at this time." So she was approved by the parole board, and the governor was like, no way.
It's like, I don't think so.
Which, I mean, I think it's worth looking at what, like 60 years after the murders almost. Like,
I'm just curious what her behavior was in prison
yeah,
to
exactly.
warrant the governor saying, absolutely
Yeah.
not.
And we've talked about this with like a little bit with the Menendez brothers, but what are you doing in prison? That should be, if you're still being crazy, if you're still talking about Helter Skelter, if you're, being
Causing fights, assaults.
right, being chaotic, then no, maybe you don't need to be released. But if you have done rehabilitative things, maybe you've gotten an education, maybe you're doing social programs, like you're helping people with disabilities, or, you're leading prayer groups.
Or you're working on yourself. That's what I was getting.
Right.
Like, doing great through therapy and stuff. I mean, if there's changes have been made,
maybe you can come out, because, these people were all young when they committed these murders.
and on drugs, big drugs.
Yes. And under the influence of another man. That's not an excuse for any of them. No. But I think it's important to consider whenever they're up for parole,
60
are they
years
really
later.
crazy 60 years later, or was it because of the time? It's just something to think about. And I will trust that she was not ready to be released.
I feel like it says a lot when the governor says, no.
Yeah. Tex Watson was convicted of the Tate-LaBianca and Hinman murders. He was sentenced to death, but his sentence was commuted to life in prison. Tex has been denied parole 18 times and is up for consideration again in 2026. Now, he's a little bit much, so he was involved in like everything. I don't know. He was kind of like Charles' right-hand man.
Yeah. What's he done in the last 60 years? Like,
yeah.
What reformation's there? Is there any?
Linda Kaz.
I would not feel safe if somebody told me the Tex gets released from jail.
No, me either. Linda Casbian was granted immunity when she was a key witness for the state, so she didn't get any prison time. Mary Bruner was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, but she was actually paroled in 1977.
That was pretty quickly.
Yeah,
she must have been a model prisoner.
Yeah. Robert Bosoli was convicted of the Gary Hinman murder and was sentenced to death before his sentence was commuted to life in prison. He was recommended for parole in 2019, but Governor Newsom also denied that parole. Finally, Charles Manson. Charles was convicted of each of the 9 murders, although he never physically killed anyone that we know of. He was sentenced to death, but his sentence was commuted to life in prison. He had several parole hearings during his time in prison, but he never took them seriously. It was not likely he'd ever be granted parole anyway due to his behavior in prison. He was constantly breaking the rules, and he never showed remorse for his actions. He was just being wild. I mean, I think he tattooed a swastika on his head. Mm-hmm. Charles died in 2017 from colon cancer. When I was looking up how Charles died, because I knew he died, most of the articles said colon cancer. I saw one that said he was beat up by a gang inside the prison, but I could not find that article again. But I want to say it because I saw it. I know I did.
Are you on a different timeline? Like, is this
I don't know.
Glitch in the Matrix?
I feel like it is because I saw it, but I could not find it again. And I didn't click on it. I was like, oh, I'll look at this article and then I'll read that article.
And then you couldn't back and find
it. And
then
it wasn't there. So officially he died from colon cancer. But maybe not. I don't know. Although not killing anyone himself, Charles Manson was a manipulative and charismatic person who convinced several people to believe him with the assistance of LSD. His hippie lifestyle drew in those who were looking for somewhere to belong during the 60s. He preyed on the vulnerable and used them to do his bidding. There are few as notorious as Charles Manson.
Right.
Hopefully we all learned why.
Yeah. There's not even people that don't follow true crime like we do.
You know Charles Manson.
Right. And whenever the one girl was released on parole there a few years ago, last year. Yeah, it's still 2024.
Yeah.
When she was released last year, I can remember like the uproar and she should never be released, blah, blah.
I think it's important to give people second chances when they're deserved.
Well, yeah, and like we've
Yeah.
said it a few times in this episode now, like what she did during prison.
And it must have been good because clearly Governor Newsom is not afraid to block the parole for this group.
Yeah, definitely.
So, I don't know, but let us know what you guys think down in the comments. If you made it this far, put a horse in the comments for the ranch.
Oh, okay. I was like, what?
Put a horse down in the comments. Make sure you like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're listening over on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts, make sure you leave us a rate and review or a comment on Spotify.
Head on over to TikTok and Instagram and give us a follow there at Spooky Sleuths Pod. We post there pretty regularly. And on that note,
Stay spooky, friends.